A low moan of wind swept across the barren plains of Redstone Valley as dusk settled over the rugged Montana frontier, and when it came the lingering scent of sagebrush and bitter regret. At the heart of this unforgiving land stood the sprawling ranch of Elias Crowe, a cattle baron whose once proud estate now lay shrouded in solitude and grief. The weathered wooden fence creaked in the evening breeze, and the distant lowing of cattle echoed like mournful laments through the twilight. Once, Elias had been the epitome of frontier success, possessing a keen eye for cattle and an iron that had built his legacy from blood and sweat. But now, since the untimely death of his beloved wife, each creak and gust of wind was a reminder of his irreparable loss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. Inside the main cabin, Elias sat in a creaking rocker by a modest fire that struggled against the chill of early autumn. His eyes, dark and haunted, were fixed on a faded portrait of his late wife, their smiles forever caught in a happier time now lost to the relentless passage of time. His heart, heavy with grief like a stone buoyed in a turbulent river, ached daily for the silence that her absence had imposed upon his once vibrant life. In the quiet hours after sunset, sorrow and duty wrestled within him, for he had little left of the life he once knew, a legacy now measured in the endless expanse of cattle call and the solitary roar of the distant wind. The ranch hands, a rough and motley crew of survivors weathered by a hostile frontier, grumbled amongst themselves about the meager grub and the failing cook. Every day, they complained about the scanty meals that barely nourished their demanding bodies after endless hours of hard labor. Elias, stoic and worn, had tried to ignore their complaints. His mind was too weighed down by his own uncertainties to heed the clamor of hunger. Yet now, as the biting cold had forced the supply lines to falter, he was left with no other recourse than to post anew for a cook, a call for help out on the wilds of Montana that carried the quiet desperation of a man left with little choice. Late one bitter evening, Elias unfurled a scrap of paper and, in a careful, deliberate hand, scribbled a notice. The notice bore the stark heading, "Cook wanted, must prepare sustenance for a hard-bitten ranch. Inquiries at Crowe Ranch, Redstone Valley." The ink, smudged by the persistent chill of the night, recorded not only the need for nourishment, but also, implicitly, the promise of a new beginning, a possible respite from the isolation that gnawed at his soul. With callous fingers, he posted the notice on the main post by the sagging wooden gate, under the vast Montana sky. That simple missive fluttered briefly in the cool wind before settling in quiet permanence against old cedar. For weeks, the notice languished in relative obscurity, passing in quiet dismissal among the local folks who deemed it another eccentricity of a man with a troubled past. Still, beneath that veneer of indifference, rumors began to circulate in hushed tones in the nearby town. Some said Elias had once built his fortune with a ruthless edge, while others whispered softly of the depth of his sorrow since his wife's passing. Yet none believed that within the rigid language of his call for a cook might lie the promise of an unexpected life yet to begin. Across the wide wilderness, traveled by rugged stagecoaches and solitary drifters, one figure made her way steadily toward Redstone Valley. In a cramped carriage rattling along a dusty road from Chicago, Ellen Harrow, a determined single mother by another name, tucked her few prized possessions close. Among these was a small, cracked brooch that had once belonged to her mother. It shone with a resilience that echoed her inner strength. At 28, having lost both her kin, the cold slaughters of a harsh post-war world, and her dreams in a storm of rejected promises, she clung desperately to the hope of a fresh start in the wild frontier. Arriving in Montana with little more than a false name and a burning need for renewal, Ellen felt the weight of both the biting wind and the unyielding hunger of new land. Her journey had been marked by frostbitten fingers and nights spent under starlight on hard-packed earth, where each moment was a test of her will. Now, as her carriage rolled to a halt before the worn gate of Crowe Ranch, the wind seemed to carry a promise, a soft murmur amid the howling that whispered of fate's unpredictable design. Ellen stepped down onto the splintered wooden porch, every step echoing against the silence of the vast Montana plains. With eyes determined and a throat choked by memories of loss, she approached the gate where Elias's posted notice fluttered in the cold. As she neared, the distant glow of a lantern from within the cabin illuminated the worn path ahead, drawing her deeper into the mystery of this isolated refuge. Taking a steadying breath, she lifted her gaze and called softly, "Please, Mr. Crowe, I've got no one left." Her words, raw and laden with desperate sincerity, cut through the autumn air like a plea etched in ice. Inside, Elias heard the gentle, yet firm intonation of a voice he hadn't anticipated. Setting aside the faded portrait, he moved silently through the hushed interior of his cabin, the weight of his grief momentarily lifted by the sound of a single, resolute plea. As he stepped outside, the cold air coiled around his figure. For a moment he hesitated, caught between the defense of solitary legend and the faint stirring of renewed hope. The voice belonged to no one he recognized, yet it resonated with the echo of every lost promise and unfulfilled need that had haunted him since his wife's passing. Standing at the gate in the deepening dusk was a slender silhouette, a woman whose eyes burned with a mixture of sorrow, determination, and the quiet fierceness of one who has known abandonment. Her posture held a resilience that defied the crushing solitude of past grief, and in her gaze, Elias sensed a reflection of his own hidden depths. Without a word, her presence spoke volumes, of a heart broken yet unyielding, of a soul that had survived the bitter decline of disillusionment, and of a glimmer of possibility that a future might yet be forged in the ruins of the past. For a long moment, a heavy silence enveloped them at the threshold of Crowe Ranch, a tableau of sorrow and tentative hope painted in the fading hues of the western sky. Then, as if compelled by forces beyond both their reckoning, the gate creaked open. The stranger's figure, cloaked in the uncertainty of her new world, stepped inside, and with it, the promise of change stirred the lonely corridors of Elias Crowe's guarded heart. As darkness deepened around them, the chilled night settled like a shroud. One final, lingering note of fate was left unanswered, a solitary silhouette against the vast, indifferent frontier. And so, with the wind whispering of forgotten dreams and the future shrouded in mystery, the new chapter began at Crowe Ranch, where the rejected mail-order bride turned desperate petitioner dared to step into a life that might finally offer her the hope she so desperately sought. The crackle of fire broke the silence as Jed spat into the dust. The sound reverberated through the open mess hall of Crowe Ranch in Redstone Valley, Montana, 1870. Outside, the lingering chill of early autumn clung to every splinter of the weathered wood, and the wind carried whispers of hardship along the vast plains. In that moment, as the ranch hands gathered around a low-burning fire, Ellen Harrow stirred a large iron pot over the flames with steady determination. Her eyes, reflecting both resilience and sorrow refined by loss, never ceased to scan the room as she set about proving she belonged. A woman once rejected, now compelled to earn her place by every measure of her cook's art. From the worn wooden floorboards of the mess hall, murmurs of skepticism drifted like intruding coals. Jed, a grizzled ranch hand whose rough exterior masked years of survival in a hard, uncaring land, leaned against a rickety table and grunted, "Ain't fit to eat, if you ask me." His voice carried the weight of a lifetime on the frontier, yet was laced with disbelief that a stranger, this single mother, could change the taste of their daily fare. But Ellen, undeterred by a sneer, continued to ladle steaming stew into cracked tin bowls while methodically kneading dough in a far corner. The stew's aroma began to fill the cluttered space. Rich, meaty broth simmered slowly with root vegetables, herbs picked from the wild, and whispers of smoky flavor from a trace of hickory burned low on the hearth. The scent danced around the room like a promise of renewal. Slowly, one by one, the ranch hands paused their idle grumbling and took tentative sips, their eyes softening as the warmth and flavor touched their wearied souls. Samuel Crowe, the widowed cattle baron himself and master of this rugged estate, had been tending to bureaucratic tasks in his modest office when he heard laughter and quiet exclamations echoing from the mess hall. Stepping out with measured gait, his heart, hitherto shrouded in endless grief, stirred as he watched Ellen interact with his hardened hands. Though his face still bore the lines of sorrow, his gaze lingered on her as she presented bowls of food with calm assurance. For a brief moment, surrounded by the clamor of satisfaction and reluctant praise, he remembered the simple moments once shared with his late wife, a tender smile, the clatter of pots in their humble kitchen, and his guarded heart wavered. As the meal progressed and the ranch hand skepticism melted into grudging respect, Jed's dismissive tone softened. "Reckon that stew could warm even the bitterest cold," he admitted, his voice a low rumble amid the crackling fire. The gentle murmur of approval spread like ripples across a still pond, reaching even the most stoic among them. And yet, while the meal was celebrated for its nourishment, a darker undercurrent wound its way through the ranch, a subtle, persistent threat that clung to the edges of conversation like unwelcome shadows. Later that evening, as the last embers of the meal faded into memory and the ranch stirred with a mixture of hope and subdued anxiety, Samuel Crowe retired to a quiet corner of the cabin. There, in the flickering lantern glow, his mind wandered back to the past, the storm that had claimed his beloved wife, the lonely hours spent in mourning, and the bitter loneliness that had driven him to post for a cook in the first place. A heavy silence enveloped him as he finally pulled from his pocket a small, fragile keepsake, a cracked brooch that had once belonged to his wife. The brooch, worn from years of use, shone with quiet dignity even as it bore the scars of time. In its delicate fractures, he saw both the pain of his loss and the possibility of renewal, a mended seam that might, one day, bind his shattered heart anew. Across the dining hall, Ellen's keen eyes fell upon the damaged brooch the moment she passed near Samuel's study. Something tender sparked within her, a shared image of resilient beauty that had survived despair. Later that night, after the ranch hands had retired under a star-strewn sky, Ellen quietly approached him. "Mr. Crowe," she said softly, "if I might, I'd like to help mend that brooch." Her voice was gentle but imbued with fierce resolve, a plea not only to patch a forgotten heirloom, but to heal the silent wounds that haunted the man before her. Samuel's eyes met hers in the dim light, revealing a flicker of vulnerability he had long kept hidden. After a long, hesitant pause, he nodded, and together they set about the careful work of gluing and wrapping the fragile metal with strips of homespun cloth. Their fingers brushed now and then, a quiet contact that spoke of shared grief and tentative healing. In that unguarded moment, Eleanor's actions, the repair of delicate keepsake, echoed deeper themes of reconciliation and hope, slowly bridging the cavern between solitude and companionship. Outside that tranquil scene, an undercurrent of alarm began to unsettle the ranch. One brisk frost-laden morning, a ranch hand found that several head of cattle were missing from the pen, leaving behind only a few scattered tracks in the frost. Worse yet, pinned to the damaged part of a split fence was a crudely scrawled note in red ink: "Leave or pay." The message, stark and malicious, hinted at an enemy lurking in the vast expanse, a rival group of rustlers who had long-eyed Crowe's holdings with greedy ambition. The discovery rippled through the ranch like an ominous drumbeat. Samuel's face grew grim as he gathered his trusted men, and even Jed, who had earlier mocked the new cook's efforts, now eyed the ruined fence with furrowed brow. The growing threat of rustler mischief and possible violence darkened the evening's fleeting calm, while rumors began to permeate quietly among the ranch hands and even trickled into the nearby town through word of mouth. A sense of impending peril wrapped itself around the night air. Ellen, aware of this disturbance, felt her pulse quicken with a blend of determination and alarm. As she finished cleaning the last of the utensils, she steeled herself and approached Samuel, her eyes clear and resolute. "We must secure the pen," she stated firmly. "If these rustlers plan to strike again, we won't have any choice but to stand our ground." Her words, measured and brave, resonated with a raw urgency that belied her previously composed demeanor. Samuel, whose grief had deepened into a hardened shield against the relentless cruelty of the frontier, nodded gravely. "Ain't that the bitter truth of these parts?" he replied softly, his voice laden with resignation yet firm with resolve. The two exchanged a long look. one that spoke of shared burdens, of quiet hopes, and of futures that depended on how they responded to threat now emerging from the wild lands beyond. That night, as the wind continued to hiss against the broken fence and the cold seeped into every crevice of Crowe Ranch, Ellen stole a moment for herself. In the dim lantern glow, she retrieved from beneath her threadbare, dust-to-the-crack brooch she had carried all the way from Chicago, a small relic of her past and a symbol of her unyielding resolve. Its delicate scars reminded her of both pain and beauty, of loss and the strength to forge a new path. As she held it, she vowed silently that no matter what terror lurked beyond those weathered walls, she would stand firm and prove her worth. The next morning, as the frost began to thaw under the reluctant kiss of an overcast sky, a subtle but ominous silence blanketed the ranch. The note pinned on the damaged fence loomed in their minds, a challenge, a threat that promised escalation. With wary hands, Samuel and Ellen surveyed the perimeter, the damaged wood and scattered tracks a testament to the harsh reality of life on the Montana frontier. Even as the morning light brought a fragile warmth, the note's message echoed in every gust: leave or pay. In that moment, as the ranch lay shrouded in a heavy fog of uncertainty, Ellen and Samuel exchanged determined glances. Their partnership, nascent and hard-won, was now poised to be tested by an enemy both known and unseen. Every step forward, every cautious decision, would be measured against the ever-present danger of betrayal and loss. With hearts fortified by shared grief and the promise of renewal, they prepared to rally their men and secure the ranch's defenses. The day would come when their unity was to be tested in the dust and cold of battle, a day when hope would have to be stitched together anew, a fragile thread, trembling in the wind, yet determined to hold fast against the storms of fate. As the sun emerged slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows over a battered fence and a field scarred by loss, Ellen clutched her cracked brooch close. Here, amid the struggle for survival and the bitter realities of the frontier, she resolved to nurture the bond that had begun to mend what time and grief had torn apart. With the threat of the rustlers etched in every step they took, her journey to prove her worth was only just beginning, and the future, uncertain and fragile as it might be, would depend on the strength of the hearts that dare to defy it. Hoofbeats thundered through the frost as shadows closed in on Crowe Ranch's cattle pen, a stark and brutal symphony of defiance and dread in the dead of night. The cold was unyielding, slicing through the darkness like a blade, and in its wake, the sound of approaching riders grew ever louder. In the midst of that harsh noise, a chorus of desperate murmurs and clattering chains filled the air. Rustlers had come. Elias Crowe, whose weary eyes still bore the scars of unhealed grief, stood at the edge of the pen with his flintlock rifle gripped tight in trembling hands. The frozen ground beneath his boots crunched with every determined step as he surveyed the intrusion. Alongside him, Ellen Harrow, resolute and quietly fierce, crouched low, her gaze fixed on the subtle tracks left in the fresh frost. Clutched in her gloved hand was her cherished cracked brooch, a memory of lost kin and a token of resilience that she held as if it were only prayer against the cold night. The rustlers, figures cloaked in worn duster coats and with faces partially hidden by shadowy hats, had burst into the cattle pen with savage speed. Their intrusion was marked by a volley of heavy footsteps and a high-pitched squeal of boots against the frozen earth. Among the chaos, a low shout rang out. "Hold the line!" It was Jed, one of the hard-bitten ranch hands who had long doubted the value of everything Ellen had brought with her. Yet, in this moment of crisis, his skepticism had little time to fester as he rushed forward, lasso in hand. Ellen's sharp eyes flicked over the disturbed tracks, her mind piecing together the directions of the assault. "They're coming from the northwest," she murmured, voice low but steady, as she knelt to examine the fresh, muddied impressions in the frost. Every hoofbeat, every scuff of leather on wood, was etched in the soft layer of snow, a map of impending danger that only her keen senses could decipher. "We must shield the cattle." Her words were barely audible over the chorus of chaos, yet they carried the weight of command that belied her gentle frame. Elias nodded grimly, already formulating a plan that blended instinct with decades of hardened experience. "Reckon this here is more than a mere cattle rustle," he intoned, his voice rough as dry bark. "These men, these rustlers, are driven by more than greed. There's grudge in their eyes, a dark vendetta born of old land disputes." He glanced over at Ellen, whose gaze was as intense as if it could read the stories in the earth. The man's voice carried both menace and sorrow as he recalled. "My boy, my son lost his life over this very stretch of land. The leader of these outlaws, he's always blamed me for what he sees as a theft of heritage." His confession, whispered amidst the surge of danger, struck a fragile chord in the cold night air. As the rustlers pressed their attack, a hail of gunfire erupted. The staccato burst of flintlock shots exploded in the darkness, illuminating, for a split, the fierce determination on each weathered face. Ellen's eyes shimmered with a mix of terror and resolve. She clutched her rifle, ready to fire again if needed. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood, mingling with the scent of frozen creek water and the distant, bitter odor of scorched earth. With her tracking skills guiding the defense, Ellen pointed out the rustlers' movements. "They're flanking us to the eastern ridge," she said in a hushed urgency. Her eyes darted over frost and shattered cattle, every detail absorbed like a whispered secret. Jed, now in the thick of the engagement, grunted his reluctant admiration as he swung his lasso roughly to secure a pair of invaders. "Hold on, I'm with you, miss," he growled, his usual derision softened by the shared cause. In the midst of that tumult, as chaos and courage clashed in the darkness, a moment of fragile connection emerged between the weary leader and the resolute cook. Elias, still reeling from the long-ago loss of his boy, stared intently at Ellen. The sight of her narrow features set in determined focus. The way she balanced a tremor of fear with an inner strength moved him. For a heartbeat, the grim world around them softened to a memory of another time, a quiet, almost forgotten afternoon spent with his late wife, when every shared smile was etched with hope. Yet grief remained, a knife under skin. "They're here," he murmured, anguish lacing his tone, "and I'm not letting them take what little is left." As more shots rang out, the rustlers, realizing that the defense was far fiercer than anticipated, began to falter. Their organized assault wavered under the relentless and coordinated defense led by Elias and powered by Ellen's swift tracking. Slowly, their numbers thinned as they retreated into the dark, their footprints fading across the frost like lost echoes of regret. In their hasty retreat, one of the assailants, his face momentarily illuminated by the metallic flash of a gun, dropped a crumpled scrap of paper that skittered across the frozen ground and came to rest near a splintered post. There, in the harsh glare of the moon, lay a note in ragged handwriting. "Leave or pay." Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she picked up the note. It was a stark reminder that this attack was not simply random, but part of a larger grudge. The same grudge that had cost Samuel his son. Clutching the paper tightly in one hand and her cracked brooch in the other, Ellen glared into darkness as if daring the night to reveal its secrets. The note's chilling demand added weight to every step they took in the aftermath of the brief but fierce assault. She could feel her heart pounding like a drum in the silent pause that followed the enemy's retreat. In that lull, Jed stopped and, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimace, muttered, "Seems them rustlers had a score to settle." His words, laced with reluctant respect for their brave resistance, trailed off into the anxious silence. Elias soon gathered his men around meager fires that burned bright against the creeping cold. "We stood fast tonight," he said quietly, voice resonating like a benediction to their resolve. "And we'll be ready if they come again." His declaration was both a promise and a sorrowful tribute to the battles that had left him hollow for so long. Ellen joined him at the edge of the cattle pen, where the faded tracks of the retreating rustlers led into the endless white expanse of ice and dust. In the flickering light of a single lantern, she hesitated before speaking. "I followed their tracks as best I could. There's more to this anger than just cattle. They seek retribution for old wounds." Her measured tone carried a maturity that belied her youth, a testament to the harsh lessons of the frontier. Elias's eyes, normally guarded and distant, softened momentarily as he regarded Ellen. "Reckon you've got a keen mind for tracking and a stronger spirit than most," he said, his voice gruff yet touched with admiration. "My boy's memory has long been haunted by these scores, these bitter battles over land. And tonight reminded me how easily our pain can spur us on to ruin." His gaze lingered on the note clutched in Ellen's hand, and his tone grew reflective. "I lost more than a son that fateful day. I lost any hope of peace. But perhaps, maybe there's a chance to stitch together a new future, if we're both willing to fight for it." The cold night, heavy with the remnants of gunfire and whispered curses, bore witness to the bond that was slowly forming between the resolute cook and the grief-stricken cattle baron. As the rustler tracks faded into the dark distance, the silence that followed was as charged as any battle cry. Ellen tucked the threatening note securely into her coat, her mind already racing with plans to fortify the ranch. Her eyes, aflame with a determined light, shimmered with the promise of relentless endurance. In the final moments of the night, as the horizon faded into a murky silhouette and the air grew colder still, Ellen and Elias exchanged one last look, a quiet, unspoken vow that whatever came next, they would stand together. The damaged fence, the fading footprint of the attack, and the stinging memory of the shared grudge formed a tapestry of sorrow and resolve that would shape the days to come. With the faint sounds of the retreating enemy echoing behind them and the chill of the Montana night wrapping its tendrils around the ranch, the stage was set for an uncertain future. As they moved back toward the heart of Crowe Ranch, the subtle whisper wind and the weight of old wounds intermingled to leave a lingering question in the open silence. Would their newfound unity be enough to hold off the specter of vengeance that still prowled the frozen plains? A creak of wagon wheels broke the dawn as figures emerged from the mist over Redstone Valley, their outlines blurred by the chill and lingering fog. The sound, stark against the quiet of early morning, signaled the arrival of those who would soon test the fragile new alliances at Crowe Ranch. Elias Crowe and Ellen Harrow, having barely recovered from the chaos of the previous night, led a small contingent into the nearby town. Their faces were grim with determination, as though each step carried the weight of the past, yet each stride was fueled by the promise of renewal. The streets of the frontier town were deserted in the pre-dawn gloom, with only the occasional shuffle of boots and the low murmur of whispered rumors. Elias rode his buckboard silently while Ellen walked beside him, her hand never leaving the small, cracked brooch she had carried since her arrival. That brooch, the cherished relic from her departed kin, had come to symbolize her defiance and hope, even as it bore the scars of harsh life in the big city. They soon found themselves outside a weather saloon, its swinging doors creaking in the cold wind. There, leaning against the wall with a sneer painted on his scarred face, stood Amos Kane, the imposing leader of the local rustlers and the man who had been behind the attack the previous night. He was a rough, formidable presence in a threadbare duster, his eyes glinting with a mix of greed and old grievances. Rumor had it that Amos believed Warwick's land was rightfully his, claiming that the deed had been unfairly transferred through dubious means. "Reckon you've come to barter your pride, Crowe," Amos sneered as Elias dismounted. "That rustler deed, as you call it, belongs to me. I ain't about to let some sorrowful cattle baron hold on to what should be mine." His tone was as hard and unforgiving as the frozen earth beneath their feet. Elias's eyes narrowed, shadows of his grief making his expression even sterner. "I hold no claim but to what I've earned in blood, sweat, and loss. And these lands are mine by right, not through deceit," he replied in a low voice that carried the weight of unspoken memories, memories of his lost son and of the promises he once made in the wake of tragedy. Ellen, stepping forward with a calm that belied the tempest within her, interjected, "Mr. Kane, sir, I may be a stranger, but I've labored hard to mend more than food and fences here. I bring hope, and I'm not afraid to stand by Mr. Crowe." Her voice was soft yet resolute, and she held her head high even as the bitter cold stung the edges of her cheeks. Amos scoffed, crossing his arms with a dismissive gesture. "Hope? What use has hope when it's as brittle as spun glass? You, a cook of no renown, can't change the fate of these lands, he barked. His tone betrayed both arrogance and the festering wounds of his own past, wounds that had driven him to a vengeful path. Before Elias could respond, the mood in the gathering shifted as a few of the gathered townsfolk began murmuring among themselves. Among them was Jed, the reluctant ranch hand who had twice before scoffed at Ellen's competence, but now appeared more subdued, and Lyle, the salt-of-the-earth saloon keeper who had seen enough hardship to know when to yield. Their eyes, flitting between Amos and Elias, hinted at an unspoken question: who would ultimately protect a fragile piece of this barren land? In a bold, almost desperate act that encapsulated everything she had fought for since leaving behind a life of loneliness in Chicago, Ellen reached into her sash and produced a cracked brooch. The metal, warm but resilient, glinted in the weak dawn light. With steady hands, she held out toward Amos. "Take this," she said, voice trembling with a mix of defiance and hope. "Let it be a symbol that we seek to mend what has been shattered, not through blood, but through acknowledgement of our shared grief." For a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to still. Amos's hardened expression faltered as he regarded the brooch. Its intricate design, even in its broken form, told a story of endurance, of surviving against all odds. He glanced at Elias and then at Ellen, as though weighing sincerity in her eyes against the bitterness of his own losses. "You think a piece of metal will fix everything?" he muttered, almost inaudibly. Yet, even as he spoke, a muted transformation flickered across his features, a slow softening that belied years of hardened resentment. Before any further words could be exchanged, a raucous shout from within the saloon shattered the tenuous calm. Preacher Ezra, whose sermons had once soothed the restless souls of his frontier town, stepped out from the building, his eyes aflame with righteous indignation. "Now, listen here, all of y'all," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the old wooden sidewalks. "We're in this land together, judged by the same unforgiving skies. Let anger not be our master, but let justice and compassion light our way." His words, imbued with both the heaviness of loss and the hope of redemption, began to sway the crowd. Even Jed's features relaxed, and a few of the gathered voices joined in a shaky chorus of reluctant support for the tentative peace. Amos Kane grunted, turning away slowly, as if the weight of her brooch and Ezra's sermon pressed upon him. "I reckon this isn't the end," he said gruffly, before a few of his men backed away into the swirling mist at the edge of town. But before he could retreat entirely, a rough scrap of paper fluttered out from under his boot, a note, hastily scribbled, pinned to a battered post. "Time's up." The terse message sent a chill down every spine, its stark simplicity underscoring that the trouble was far from over. Back on the porch of Crowe Ranch, as the bitter dawn slowly yielded to the full light of day, Elias and Ellen returned to the ranch with a quiet resolve. The confrontation in town had not ended the threat. It had only delayed it. Yet within that brief interlude, a new understanding was forged. Elias, still haunted by the memory of his son, but emboldened by Ellen's bravery, led his remaining men to inspect the damaged fence along the north side of property. The broken boards and splintered railings bore the unmistakable marks of the night's skirmish, a grim ledger to the cost of pride and vengeance. Side by side, with the morning chill still biting, Elias and Ellen set about mending the fence. Their work was slow and deliberate, each act of repair an unvoiced promise that they would not surrender to the cruelty of their enemies. As they hammered and nailed, Ellen's fingers brushed against Elias's calloused hand, and in that simple touch lay a silent pledge, a fragile thread of trust woven through sheer hardship. Standing there, the echo of Ezra's words in the fading thread of the note, Elias murmured, "We must be ready, for the Canes won't let this go easily." His voice, resonant with determination born of regret, was met with Ellen's steady reply, "We'll stand together, Mr. Crowe. I won't let them break what we built." Even as they worked, the unfaltering gaze of Jed followed their progress, and the distant rumble of wagon wheels hinted at further stirrings in the town. Yet for that fleeting moment on the mended fence, hope, tender and fragile as a woven thread, shone bright in the hearts of the two. It was a promise of partnership, a defiance against a world that had long been unyielding in its cruelty. And as they finished securing the last loose plank, the silence of the morning was punctuated by one final, subtle note, a whisper on the wind that carried the ominous echo of "Time's Up." The note, hanging like a specter over Crowe Ranch, was a reminder that while the immediate threat had been momentarily repelled, the forces of vengeance still lingered in the shadows, ready to challenge this nascent bond once more. In that suspended breath of moment under the vast, indifferent sky of Montana, Elias and Ellen exchanged a look that spoke of unspoken promises and the daunting task that lay ahead. Promises to defend their newfound unity, to meet the coming storm with hearts fortified by shared loss and resolute hope. Thus, with the echo of the clipped note fading into the cool morning air, the men and women of Crowe Ranch began to prepare for the next inevitable test. Each hammer blow, each repaired board, a quiet testament to a future that, while uncertain, shimmered with the faint, enduring light of possibility. Frost crunched as Ellen aimed at the rustler ambush, her breath visible in the biting air like wisps of lost hope. The moon hung low over Redstone Valley, bathing the frozen creek and nearby cabin in a pallid, shivering light. Tonight, all that remained of Crowe Ranch was marked by the scars of recent violence and the fragile promise of renewal. The sound of approaching hooves, steady, determined, accompanied by the ragged clatter of worn spurs, signaled the final wave of the rustlers, their intent as cold and ruthless as the winter wind. Around the perimeter of the ranch, Elias Crowe had rallied his few remaining loyal hands. Beside him, Jed, whose earlier skepticism had given way to hard-won respect, gripped his lasso tightly. Lyle, the saloon keeper with a tempered soul, had joined from town, his steady gaze commanding caution rather than malice. In the dim light by the frozen creek, these men braced for confrontation, their voices hushed but determined. As the rustlers emerged from the darkened tree-line, long shadows stretched across the icy ground, their figures blurred yet menacing in movement. Among them stood Amos, a gaunt face hardened by years of bitter rivalry and loss, his eyes burning with a vengeful fire. He stepped forward, voice echoing against the stillness. "It's over, Crowe. The deed is mine by right, as sure as blood was spilled for it." His tone was both an accusation and a final demand, heavy with the legacy of old wounds. Ellen's heart pounded, yet she lifted her rifle with steady purpose. "We ain't leaving," she declared softly, her voice resonating with the defiant note of a woman forged in the crucible of rejection and hardship. In that moment, every sense seemed heightened. The sharp tang of ice in the air, the low rumble of distant thunder, and the echo of hooves racing along the creek. She moved with conviction, each step deliberate as she noted the tracks crisscrossing the frozen ground, a map of the intruder's approach that only her keen eyes could decipher. Elias, standing resolute beside her, surveyed the scene through eyes dimmed by grief yet burning with the hardened resolve of a man who'd known loss all too intimately. His own battle scars, physical and spiritual, spoke of nights spent in silent mourning over the memory of his departed son. Tonight, as he peered into the faces of the advancing rustlers, he recalled the bitter dispute over land that had cost him dearly. "They come with blood and bitterness," he murmured, voice low and measured, "driven by the same sorrow that haunted me." His words, heavy with regret and the weight of time, resonated deeply with everyone present. The confrontation escalated as the rustlers, emboldened by Amos's sneer, advanced toward the cabin. Gunfire erupted in sharp staccato bursts, the flintlock rifles behind Elias and his men answering the call. Amid the ensuing chaos, Ellen's eyes tracked every movement with expert precision. She darted from cover to cover, her commands quiet yet insistent: "Hold the line," and "Don't let 'em break through." Her actions reflected both the ferocity of protection and the fragile hope that had brought her so far from a life of despair. In the swirling maelstrom of chaos, a tense silence fell over the frozen creek for a breathless moment when Amos stepped forward and demanded, "What is it you hope to gain here besides ruin?" His voice, though rough, faltered as he noticed the weariness in Elias's eyes. As if compelled by a secret sorrow, Amos's features softened even as his hand hovered near the grip of his rifle. Then, in a voice thick with suppressed pain, he continued, "I lost my son in that damn dispute long ago. They say you stole my birthright, Crowe, but even I know the price of blood is too dear." In that instant, the cold veneer of enmity cracked, and the shared grief of unhealed hearts shone through the gloom. Elias's gaze met Amos's, and the tension on the cold, hard ground seemed to suspend like fragile ice. In that charged moment, Ellen stepped forward, feeling the ever-present weight of her own resolve. With trembling yet calm hands, she exposed a small, cherished brooch that she had carried with her since Chicago, a fractured relic, yet imbued with stories of her mother's strength and her own desperate survival. "Take this," she said, voice firm yet laden with vulnerability. "Let it symbolize that we wish to mend our losses instead of perpetuating our grief." Her words, echoed by the soft crackle of a nearby fire, hung in the frosty air as a proposal of peace. The rustler leader, Amos, took the offering with a hesitant gesture. His rugged fingers brushed lightly against hers as he accepted the brooch, and for a long, heavy moment, the world seemed to pause as both men absorbed the resonance of that simple act, a token of surrender, of reconciliation in a world too often defined by unyielding conflict. "It's over," Amos whispered, though his tone was uncertain, as if the weight of his loss was too vast and unburdened with a single phrase. In that same breath, from the shadows of the encroaching crowd, Preacher Ezra and Sarah Wells stepped forward, their voices, now carrying a unified message of measured justice, intermingled with the fading echoes of gunfire. "There is no honor in endless vengeance," Ezra intoned, his words reverberating off the snowbound ground. "Let us find redemption in understanding rather than in more blood spilled." Sarah, ever practical and compassionate, added, "We already lost too much here. It's time to rebuild what's left." Slowly, the rustlers began to lower their weapons as the weight of collective sorrow and the promise of reconciliation pierced the wintry veil of hostility. The retreat was not boisterous, but marked by resigned steps into the darkness, as though the invaders recognized that the fight had drained them more than it mended anything. In their hurried departure, a few of the rustlers dropped scraps of paper, including one final, ominous note. "Time's up." Back at Crowe Ranch, the echoes of the confrontation retreated like a fading storm. Elias and Ellen, along with Jed and Lyle, who had throughout the ordeal demonstrated uncharacteristic loyalty, turned their attention to the damaged fence, a symbol of the night's chaos and the physical manifestation of their struggle. Together, they began the slow, deliberate work of mending the broken boards and splintered rails. Each hammer stroke and every careful nail secured was a silent ode to their determination to rebuild and, with it, the promise of a future unmarred by endless vendettas. As they worked, amidst the steady clamor of labor, Ellen's gaze lingered on the small thing that had transformed from a symbol of rejection into one of tentative hope, the brooch. With skilled fingers, she held it aloft one last time. "This," she said softly, "is now given as a token of our shared loss, and our shared hope that we can finally bury what grieves us." Her voice was quiet but resonated with the weight of an unyielding will to reconcile the past. Elias, his face softened by a mixture of sorrow and newfound resolve, nodded slowly. "It ain't just about holding on to what's broken," he murmured, "but about learning to mend it piece by piece." His words, like gentle echoes over the patched fence, spoke of redemption unexpectedly found in the cold crucible of hardship. In that moment, as the last rays of dawn broke through a slowly dissipating fog, the tone throughout Crowe Ranch shifted imperceptibly. Their shared labor on the damaged fence, the quiet offering of the brooch, and the subdued retreat of their adversaries forged a bond between Elias and Ellen, a bond not of romance in the traditional sort, but of mutual respect and unspoken promise. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces set against the lingering chill and the uncertain future. Yet as a repaired fence took shape under their careful hands, the faded note left by the rustlers lay pinned against one weathered post, a final reminder, a grim punctuation in the lengthy chapter of frontier hardship. The note's terse command, "Time's up," shimmered in the muted light, hinting that the struggle was far from over. As the day advanced, the men at Crowe Ranch resolved to bolster their defenses against any further ambush. In small, determined voices, they agreed that the unity forged in tonight's ordeal had to be preserved at all costs, even if it meant continued vigilance in a land scarred by old grudges. In the cool air of that hopeful morning, as the newly mended fence stood resilient against the vast plains of Montana, Elias Crowe and Ellen Harrow exchanged a look laden with silent promises. Their partnership, born out of shared grief, hard-earned respect, and the willingness to embrace reconciliation, now pointed toward a future where resilience could triumph over relentless despair. And while the rustler note still whispered ominously of challenges yet to come, the ranch itself, bathed in the gentle glow of a rising sun, stood as a steadfast testament to new beginnings forged on the anvil of shared trials. With peaceful determination, Elias murmured, "We'll rebuild piece by piece." Ellen, her eyes shining with resolve, added quietly, "And we'll do it together." Their words, understated yet potent, resonated across the frosted expanse, mingling with the promise of warm fields waiting to be sown. Thus, amid the cold silence of the frontier and the echo of a threat that might one day return, Crowe Ranch began its slow and steady rebirth. In the quiet labor, in the mended fence, and in the fragile offering of a once-cracked brooch turned symbol of peace, hope took root, delicate, persistent, and ready to grow once more against all odds.